Welcome to the National Gallery. My name is Letizia Treves, and I'm the curator of the later Italian, Spanish, and French 17th century paintings. And today I'm going to talk to you about what was billed as our newest acquisition. But for those of you who've been following the news, we announced an acquisition last week of a painting by Artemisia Gentileschi, a self-portrait. So what I'm talking about today is not our newest acquisition, but it is the most recent acquisition in the Spanish part of the collection. I'm going to talk today about Juan de Zurbarán's Still Life with Lemons in a Wicker Basket. So welcome to everyone here in the room, and for those of you watching on YouTube, thank you. So I'm delighted to be standing here today to talk to you about this picture, and it's really a celebration of this great acquisition of a painting by Juan de Zurbarán, and it's been a long-standing desire of the gallery, and indeed of mine, to acquire a great Spanish 17th century still life. The last one we were able to purchase was, of course, Francisco de Zurbarán's A Cup of Water and Rose, and this was purchased in 1997, but it's the only other 17th century still life. Of course, we have the two great paintings by Luis Melendez from the middle of the 18th century. But the acquisition of the Juan is really, really key. There are very few works by Juan de Zurbarán. This is, in fact, only the 13th fully attributed work or autograph work known to date, and the only one in Britain. It was discovered in a Spanish private collection in 2015 by Sotheby's. It was unknown until then, and it was then seen by myself, our head of conservation, Larry Keith, and our director, Gabriele Finaldi, in 2016. We acquired it the following year, but we didn't announce it. It underwent conservation treatment here. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. And then we were finally able to hang it and announce its acquisition in April of this year, and it now hangs in room 30, alongside paintings by his father, Francisco de Zurbarán, and other great artists of the 17th century, Velázquez, Murillo, Valdés Leal. Now, the figure of Juan de Zurbarán was only really rediscovered in 1938. He'd long been overshadowed by the fame of his father, Francisco, to whom a number of Juan's still lifes have been attributed in the past. Now, Juan's paintings are extremely rare. I mentioned before there are only a dozen or so paintings that have been identified so far. Juan was born in Lerena, which was 80 miles north of Seville, in July 1620. His mother, Francisco's first wife, Maria Paez, died when Juan was only 3 or 4 years old. In 1625, Francisco married again, and when Juan was about 9, Francisco moved his entire family to Seville, where he would set up a workshop and pretty much dominate the artistic scene there throughout the second quarter of the 17th century. Seville had a long history as an international port and a commercial hub, dating back to its founding by the Romans. It was built on the Roman city of Hispalis, and it was known in the 17th century as the New Rome. At the end of the 15th century, Seville was home to a thriving community of Genoese merchants who helped finance Christopher Columbus's expedition across the Atlantic in 1492. Now, Columbus discovered the New World, what were to become the Spanish colonies in the Americas, and where Francisco de Zurbarán shipped a number of paintings. And Seville's position as the principal port of Spain was then asserted. By royal decree, the city enjoyed a monopoly over Spain's new colonial trade. All ships going to and from the Americas had to stop first in Seville, transforming the city into one of the largest, wealthiest, and most cosmopolitan cities in Europe. By the end of the 16th century, Seville's population had risen to 150,000. That's almost double that of Rome. And then the population of Seville had dropped to 125,000 by the middle of the 17th century when the Zurbaráns were living there, but there was still double that of Madrid. Now, 1649 was a catastrophic year for Seville. When news reached the city that plague had been reported on the coast of Spain, Seville City Council made the disastrous decision to keep the city gates open for commerce. The plague epidemic reached Seville, and it ravaged the city, wiping out almost half its population. And among its victims was Juan de Zurbarán, whose life and career were cut tragically short when he was just 29 years old. It is largely for this reason that we have so few surviving works by the artist. His career spans barely 10 to 15 years. He was principally active in the 1640s, And it was also during this time that we know that he married someone called Mariana de Cuadros. She was the daughter of a very wealthy procurator in the Real Audiencia, the Court of Appeal in Seville. And she brought a considerable dowry of 50,000 reales to their marriage, much of which Juan had squandered by the time he died in 1649. Together they had 2 children, a son in 1642 and a daughter 2 years later. But otherwise, very little is known about Juan. He is recorded as having painted religious works. In 1644, he's mentioned in relation to 2 large canvases depicting miracles of Our Lady of the Rosary for the Brotherhood of the Rosary at Carmona, near Seville. But these haven't survived, and no other religious paintings have survived, so he is now exclusively known as a still life painter. Juan was certainly trained with his father Francisco, was undoubtedly his most gifted pupil, but he did probably set up his own workshop in or around 1644, just 5 years before he died. Now, a reconstruction of his activity only began in 1938, when Juan's signature and a date of 1640 were found during cleaning on this picture, the still life with chocolate service, which is now in Kiev in the Ukraine. Now, this still life had long been thought to be by Francisco de Zurbarán, the father, rather than the son. And it was only after the signature was revealed that it was used as a keystone in reconstructing Juan's oeuvre. When Odile de Lende published the 2-volume monograph on Francisco de Zurbarán's works in 2009, she incorporated works by Juan and other identifiable hands in Francisco's workshop. But at that point, she only identified 12 fully autographed paintings by Juan, and only 3 of those are signed and dated. Now, although Juan's still lives share common elements, whether they're individual objects or compositional arrangements, each picture differs considerably from the next. That is, as far as we can tell, he is not a version painter. And there is a clear evolution in his style during this very short 10 to 15 year period of activity. And his still lives can be broadly divided into 3 categories. The first consists of paintings dating to the end of the 1630s. And these have been grouped around the first signed and dated work we know. That's a still life of grapes on a plate, which I'm showing you upper right on the slide. This is now in a French private collection. This is actually painted on copper, and it's the only example in Juan's work where this support is used. The others are all on canvas. But the paintings are generally characterized by their small format. They all measure approximately 40 to 60 centimeters, so smaller than an A3 sheet. They have this very stark lighting, and there's a sort of marked simplicity to their composition, often focusing on a single element, which is usually a plate of fruit, right in the center of the composition, which is normally resting on a ledge or a tabletop. Now here, the still life of apples and the still life of lemons work very well stylistically within this group. Neither of those pictures are signed or dated, but they seem to work very well, and those have been universally accepted as works by Juan de Zurbarán. The other picture I'm showing you on this slide in Barcelona, in the Museu Nacional d'Art de Catalunya, shows a still life of fruit with a butterfly and goldfinch. And this seems to be a sort of elaboration of these early pictures, a little bit more complex, but still, let's say, not as sophisticated as the later works. The second category of paintings, which were made up generally of paintings dating to the first part of the 1640s, show how Juan's compositions have evolved. Now, these still lifes tend to incorporate multiple objects along a single plane. They have a slightly larger format. They're up to about 80 centimeters wide. And the earliest of this group is the painting in Kiev, which I already showed you, and which is signed and dated. Now here, a variety of objects are laid out on a tabletop. A silver plate, 2 blue and white porcelain cups, a wooden box, 2 pitchers, one made of silver, the other of glazed earthenware. The forms overlap one another, creating a design that is both straightforward and complex. The different materials of the objects before us, earthenware, silver, and porcelain, give Juan the opportunity to study how light falls across different surfaces. And this is something that would always interest him. And some of these elements actually reappear in still lives by Juan, dating from a little bit later. In the National Gallery painting, for example, this silver plate becomes a silver taza. You can see that it has a small stem. And the Chinese export bowls here, cups here, become a Chinese export bowl in our own painting. And these objects were clearly in circulation in Seville, and the pieces would have been readily available to both Juan and Francisco de Zurbarán. Indeed, they appear in a number of their paintings, of both by the father and the son. Now, another painting from this second group is the still life in Manta, Finland, which is signed and dated 1643. I'm showing you lower left on the slides. This is an important benchmark against which to attribute and date works of, let's call it the middle period of Juan's activity. And the painting on the right, which was only very recently discovered and acquired by the Prado in Madrid in 2016, is closely related to it, as you can see. Now, although that picture in the Prado is not signed or dated, its quality and the fact that it has changes in the composition visible in X-radiographs do suggest that it is also by Juan de Zurbarán. The left-hand picture in Finland, this one here, was long thought to be by a Neapolitan painter called Luca Forte. And in fact, it wasn't until its signature was rediscovered that it was correctly attributed to Juan. Now, many of Juan's still lives have been wrongly attributed to Roman and Neapolitan painters, as well as to his father Francisco, as I've already said. So I imagine there are a great number of them out there still to be discovered. Here you can see Juan's greater ambition in painting his still lives in this middle period. The objects are still arranged on a single plane, but the composition is more elaborate, the vine leaves and the fruit leading our eye round the picture. Juan de Zurbarán seems more in control and in command of the objects he's painting. Now, the third and final category, to which our own painting belongs, dates from these years of Juan's life at the very end, around 1643 until his death in 1649. Now, these still lives are of even greater dimensions. They often exceed a meter in width, and they display a much greater monumentality in their design. The compositions are rigorously simple, frequently incorporate a single dominating element in the center, which is often a bowl or a basket, as I'm showing you here, and flanked often by two smaller still life objects or groupings on either side. I'm showing you some more here. None of these pictures from the later period, if you like, are signed or dated, but they do form a very coherent and distinct group, and their technical refinement does suggest that they're from a more advanced period in Juan's career. There's also this painting in Chicago, where instead of the basket, you can see a beautiful porcelain bowl. I want to just pause here for a moment to consider why Juan's still lives seem to have evolved so dramatically in such a short space of time. That is why there is such a marked difference in quality and in ambition between the first and the third category of paintings I've just shown you, and yet only about 10 years have passed. Now, this may have something to do with Juan seeing still lives by other artists, but we don't know of anyone specializing in this genre in Seville before the Zurbaráns. Francisco Pacheco, the Sevillian painter and teacher of Velázquez, who wrote Arte de la Pintura, this is a vitally important account of the lives of the Spanish artists. He makes a point of naming those who excelled in painting still lives. He makes no mention of Francisco de Zurbarán or of Juan de Zurbarán, and this may be because Francisco was not exclusively a still life painter, and Juan was probably not yet fully active as one. The Arte de la Pintura wasn't published until 1649, the year of Juan's death, but Pacheco had already finished writing it in 1638, and that is a year before the first known dated work by Juan. Of the still life painters Pacheco does mention, Blas de Prado, Juan Sánchez Cotan, and Juan van der Hamen y León, it's worth looking at the last of these. Juan van der Hamen was widely considered one of Madrid's best painters, particularly in his own lifetime. He was born in 1596 and he died in 1631, when Juan de Zurbarán was only 11 years old. Now, although van der Hamen was active also as a portraitist and a religious painter, it was his still lives that drew the greatest admiration. As well as being collected by the Spanish king, van der Hamen's still lives were sought after by wealthy collectors. We don't know if Juan de Zurbarán ever went to Madrid. He may have accompanied his father Francisco in 1634. That was when Francisco was working on the decoration of the Hall of Realms in the Buen Retiro Palace. But more likely, Juan would have seen the works of van der Hamen in Sevillian collections. Now here I'm showing you three different still lives by van der Hamen, all painted within 5 to 10 years of each other. And in some ways, they do echo the different categories of pictures I've shown you by Juan de Zurbarán. produced over a very similar period of time, beginning with a single still life element on a plate, more complex arrangements on a single plane, and then, of course, the more elaborate compositions where objects are placed on different levels. Now, another possible influence could be Pedro de Camprobin, who was an artist who trained in Toledo but moved to Seville around 1630. Now, many of Camprobin's still lives date from 1650s onwards, that is after Juan's death. But a fragment of what was once a larger still life painting, which was signed by Camprobin, does suggest that he was looking at Francisco de Zurbarán's work, and therefore probably came into contact with both artists. And I'm showing you that here. The fact that there are other instances in which Camprobin and Zurbarán's compositions repeat particular motifs do seem to support this hypothesis. And if you compare these two pictures on the screen, the quality of execution in the Zurbarán is far superior to that of Camprobin, suggesting that the influence was that of Zurbarán on Camprobin and not the other way around. But of course, the greatest influence of all for Juan de Zurbarán was his father, Francisco, whose name has been associated with a number of still lives that were actually by Juan, as I've already mentioned. Now, Francisco was the leading religious painter in Seville in the 1630s and 40s, and there were often numerous still life elements in his religious works. I'm showing you a supreme example of this, a painting of Christ and the Virgin Mary in the house at Nazareth, which is now in fact, sorry, that's a mistake, it's not in Pasadena, it's actually in Cleveland. And this picture is datable to about 1640, so at a time when Juan is working in Francisco's studio. The boy Christ has just pricked his finger on a crown of thorns he's weaving and foretelling his torment when he will be forced to wear a crown of thorns on his head. And the Virgin has just paused from her sewing to silently weep. It's a scene of quiet domesticity, overshadowed by the foreboding of Christ's passion and sacrifice. But we can't help but admire Francisco's representation of everyday objects. He paints these in a highly realistic style, and he lights them very strongly, so they appear in sharp focus and its strong relief, taking on an almost mystical quality. From the arrangement of flowers in a vase on the right, to the crisp linen on Mary's lap, clearly an allusion to the shroud in which Christ's body will be wrapped after the entombment, for his entombment, or the crumpled drapery spilling out of the basket in the foreground, the solitary earthenware pot, lower left, and a table with its drawers still open, two pears still attached to their foliage sitting on top, an open prayer book, and two more books stacked precariously nearby. Now, although this is a religious picture, it is the still life elements which lead our eye around the painting, making us explore the composition and deepen our appreciation as we notice detail after detail. Francisco was clearly a master at still life painting, but his only signed and dated still life is from 1633. This is the picture now in the Norton Simon Museum in Pasadena. This is widely acknowledged as one of the artist's masterpieces and considered by many to be the greatest still life of the Spanish Golden Age. Juan was 13 years old when Francisco painted this picture, and he would have been frequenting his father's studio as an apprentice by then. Note, of course, the detail of the cup with water and a rose, which reappears, is repeated, though with differences, in our own painting by Francisco. Now, Francisco and Juan's paintings that I'm showing you on the screen do share a number of common elements. Most obviously, both artists adopt a tripartite design, that is, a composition constructed around three basic groupings. The center, dominated by a basket heaped with fruit, oranges, of course, in Francisco's painting, and lemons in our own. The objects are arranged in a single plane on a tabletop, and they're lit with very strong directional lighting, putting these objects in very high relief, and as I've said before, giving them a sort of mystical quality. The selection and placement of objects is not incidental. In both paintings, the objects are chosen for their symbolic meanings. The Norton Simon picture has been read both as a homage to the Virgin Mary and as an allusion to the Holy Trinity. I'll come back to the symbolism of specific objects in our Juan de Zurbarán in a moment. There is no doubt that pictures such as these were painted for sophisticated patrons who admired them not just for their realistic depiction of everyday things, but who also saw them as objects of devotion. Their religious symbolism would not have been lost on 17th century devout Catholic audiences. At the center of Juan's composition stands a large woven basket piled high with oversized lemons, seemingly just picked from a tree because their foliage is still attached. The leaves dance around the picture, animating the composition in a sort of balletic movement, twisting, curling, and pirouetting around the picture surface. Among the lemons, Juan has distributed a variety of flowers: red lilies, blue delphiniums, red carnations, delicate white lemon blossom in the center, 2 white roses leaning out of the basket towards us, and even a tulip upper left. Most of the flowers represented here actually bloom around the same time. Certainly the delphinium, carnations, and roses would all be in flower in early summer. But the tulip is a spring flower. The disparity in flowering times does seem to suggest that this composition is artificial, and Juan did not have the flowers arranged in front of him. Though this is not as extreme as in, say, some Dutch or Flemish paintings, where flowers from wildly different seasons are shown in bloom at the same time in the same composition. Some of Juan's chosen flowers are symbolic. The lily and the rose are often associated with the Virgin, though they are usually white, and they are seen as symbols of her purity. In fact, the orange lily, which we see here, is very unusual in paintings. I've yet to understand why Juan chose to include an orange lily and whether the color choice has a specific meaning here. In Marian imagery, the Virgin usually holds a white lily in the scene of the Annunciation, and she's also known by the title Mystic Rose. I'm showing you here a picture from our own collection. It's actually a copy after Carlo Dolci, but it's a painting based on a design of the 1640s, therefore contemporary with Juan de Zurbarán's painting. And you see the Virgin is holding an entwined branch of lilies and carnations, whilst the Christ child holds a rose. The carnation is a symbol of love or marriage, and it often appears in pictures of the Virgin and Child, because the Virgin Mary was seen as both the mother and the bride of Christ. Of course, the most famous of these is our own painting by Raphael called the Madonna of the Pinks. Pinks and carnations share the Latin name dianthus, meaning divine flower. The delphinium, which is the blue flower you can see here, takes its name from the Latin for dolphin because the buds look like tiny fish. Now, their presence here may refer to the Christian symbol of the fish, an association which existed in illuminated manuscripts as early as the 15th century and could well apply here too. But a curious detail here in our painting is the presence of this tulip with a droplet of water. And I'm showing you a detail here on the left. In Dutch and Flemish still lifes, the tulips were often included as signs of opulence and wealth, but they also had vanitas connotations. That is, they symbolize the passing of time, the transience of life. And I'm showing you here a painting by Balthazar van der Ast from our own collection, which is datable to about 1630, so just before our Juan de Zurbarán. Now, tulips appear frequently in Spanish still lifes of the latter half of the 17th century, but not so frequently before then. I'm showing you an amazing still life by Antonio Ponce, which is datable to the 1650s, and then from a decade later, a basket of flowers by Juan de Arellano. Now, Arellano made a real speciality of these still lifes, both as kind of bouquets in vases, but also in baskets where tulips feature prominently. In Juan's painting, the tulip is variegated, that is, striped. This indicates that it was actually diseased, and this was a feature that was greatly disliked in Turkey, where most tulips originated towards the end of the 16th century. But it was greatly admired and sought after in the Netherlands, where tulip fever or tulip mania took hold in the 17th century. The fact that Juan has shown a droplet of water on the flower might suggest he's trying to show a specific moment in time. The droplet will soon run down the tulip and fall. Perhaps it's a reminder that life is short, a sort of carpe diem message. The symbolism doesn't stop with the flowers in Juan's painting. Lower left, there is a very delicate porcelain cup filled with water in which a single lily floats, resting on a silver tazza. Now, this cupful of water and flower, frequently found in Marian imagery, are a clear reference to the Virgin's purity, as indeed it is also in our small still life by Francisco de Zurbarán. Now, the silver plate and tazza give both of these artists a chance to paint reflections on a shiny surface. Juan is particularly skilled in painting these different textures. Look how he differentiates between the very cool, polished surface of the silver and then the shiny porcelain cup and the very sensitive depiction of light falling on the water it contains. then the strongly curved, waxy petals of the lily. One of them's actually dropped onto the tazza and creates a beautiful orange-red reflection. And then the delicate plumage of the goldfinch perching on the lip of the cup. These are all painted in a very, very different way. The goldfinch, of course, has religious connotations as well. According to legend, the bird was said to have flown down and plucked a thorn from Christ's brow on the road to Calvary. Its plumage was apparently stained red with a drop of Christ's blood, and so the goldfinch became a symbol of Christ's passion and sacrifice in painting. I'm showing you, in fact, another picture from our own collection by Federico Barocci. Here, the infant St. John seems to be playfully teasing a cat with a goldfinch. But there's actually a much more meaningful message here. The goldfinch and indeed the reed cross that he's put down, of course, both allude to Christ's passion. The goldfinch also appears in the earlier work by Zurbarán that you've already seen. This is in Barcelona. Now here, the fact the bird refers to Christ's passion and sacrifice is further underlined by showing it as having just plucked a grape from the bunch. Grapes, of course, being a clear symbol of the wine of the Eucharist. Now, the blue and white porcelain bowl in Juan's painting is a piece of crackware. This was Chinese export porcelain produced mainly in the Wanli reign, among the very first to arrive in Europe in mass quantities. Now, some examples of this were salvaged from a shipwreck of the San Diego. This was a galleon that sunk in the Philippines in 1600. The wreck was discovered in 1992, and over 34,000 artifacts were recovered. And these included Chinese porcelain, and many of these pieces are now on display in the National Museum of Anthropology in Manila and in the Museo Naval in Madrid. Now, the bowl in Juan's paintings is of the same type and design as the ones that you see here in the slides. You can see the very delicate undulating lip of the bowl, and also the recurring motif of the deer tucked in on itself. I should mention that the blue pigment in Juan's painting has sort of degraded, it's faded. It would originally have been much brighter and therefore much closer to the original, the porcelain originals. Now, the same bowl appears again in another painting given to Francisco de Zurbarán, now in a private collection. And this does suggest that this bowl existed in the Zurbarán workshop as a prop, or was owned by them, or was indeed easily accessible to both the painters in Seville. As I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, Juan's painting had been in a Spanish private collection for several generations. When I saw the picture in 2016 with Larry Keith, our head of conservation, who was also the person who carried out the conservation treatment here at the gallery, it looked like this. The painting is in oil on canvas. The canvas is made of a plain weave fabric with a relatively coarse texture. Now, it had been relined approximately 20 years ago, and the lining had since been removed. The painted surface of the picture was very dry, and the crack pattern, which is of course a characteristic of old paintings and of 17th century paintings, was raised in a number of areas, and it meant that the canvas had to be relined here at the gallery in order to stabilize the painted surface. The paint was flaking in certain areas, and there were a few scattered losses, some of them which had been rather over-enthusiastically filled by a previous restorer. But overall, the painting was in good condition. The still life elements in particular had not suffered from wear, with the exception perhaps of the two roses. Now, these two white roses did look as if they'd been heavily retouched by a previous restorer, and we've now removed that restoration, and they do look a little bit abraded. But perhaps they were also more thinly painted. And you can look, in fact, at other paintings by Juan, in particular this painting in Chicago where the two roses reappear, and you really understand how Juan intended the light and shadow to fall on the petals of the rose. Now, in our own painting, we took the decision to do minimal retouching and filling in and to leave the roses as they were. The photos of the painting before and after conservation are not actually dramatically different as they are for other pictures, but this is largely due to the fact the painting really was in good overall condition. But what the conservation has done is to clarify Juan's extraordinary sensitivity and ability to paint very different textures. For example, look at the lemon rind, where he applies this paint so thickly, especially in the highlights, building it up to give it a sense of three-dimensionality. And in this detail, you can see the contrast of that lemon rind with the delicate pattern of the woven basket and the waxy green leaves, something he does here again. Here, the leaves are created with a much more fluid application of paint than the solid sculptural form of the lemons themselves. Or indeed here, I've already spoken about this detail, but look at how brilliantly Juan captures the gleam of polished silver and the objects caught in its reflection. And also how different that is to the lily's petals or the fluffy feathers of the goldfinch so delicately perched on the rim. I hope that this talk, and in fact these images, have encouraged you to go and look at this picture in room 30 again. And for those who haven't done so already, please do go and have a really, really close look at it. And in fact, for those watching on YouTube, I hope you'll come to see it when you next come to the National Gallery, but you can also zoom in online and really get the sort of details I've shown you here on the screen. Finally, I should just say, not many paintings lend themselves to being blown up on a big screen like this. It is a testament to Juan de Zurbarán's skill as a painter. He was one of the first civilians to specialize in painting still lives, and despite having a very small body of work, only, as I said, a dozen or so pictures, and despite his fame being overshadowed by that of his father, Juan has played a vital role in the development of still life or bodegón painting in 17th century Spain. It is therefore entirely fitting that one of his rare still lives takes its place here in Trafalgar Square, alongside pictures by his father, for our visitors to enjoy for generations to come. Thank you.